I pulled into the parking lot of the Blackwater Research Facility at 11:45 p.m., the gravel crunching under my tires as I found my usual spot near the back entrance. The building was a big concrete structure in the Nevada desert with sharp angles and no windows on the lower levels. 8 months of night shifts had made this routine automatic. Park, grab my thermos of coffee, check that my phone was fully charged, and walk through those heavy steel doors one more time. Sarah Martinez was waiting for me in the security office, her supervisor badge shining under the fluorescent light as she gathered her paperwork. She looked up when I entered, her expression as neutral as always. "Evening, Michael," she said, sliding a clipboard across the metal desk. 47 subjects currently housed. No incidents during day shift. I signed in next to the timestamp, seeing that Subject 47 was listed as active in his cell block. The facility kept test subjects in numbered rooms down long hallways with ugly green paint on the walls. My job was simple: watch them on the security cameras and follow the survival rules they taught me during my first week. "Any maintenance scheduled tonight?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Maintenance never happened during night shifts. "None. Emergency generator tested this morning, all systems operational." Sarah stood and grabbed her jacket from the back of her chair. "You know the protocol." I did know it. 8 months was longer than most people lasted in this position. The previous guy before me had made it 6 weeks. The one before him, 3 days. I'd stopped asking what happened to them after my second month. Sarah left through the main entrance. Her footsteps carried down the empty corridor until the building swallowed the sound completely. I settled into the chair behind the bank of monitors, each screen showing a different angle of the facility's interior. The subjects' rooms were numbered 1 through 50, though some had been empty for weeks. Subject 47 appeared on monitor 12, a person hunched on the narrow cot in his cell. The night passed quietly until midnight hit. That's when Subject 47 started screaming. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" His voice carried through the thick walls, muffled but desperate. The sound of his fists pounding against the reinforced door followed, a steady, rhythmic banging that made the control room vibrate slightly. I kept my hands on the desk and my eyes on the monitors. The first rule was simple: never enter a subject's room without written authorization from Dr. Harrison. The second rule made it even clearer: entering without permission meant immediate termination. Not firing, termination. Subject 47's pleas continued for over an hour, his voice growing hoarse as he begged anyone to hear him. On the monitor, I could see him throwing himself against the door, his shoulder hitting the metal with enough force that it should have broken bones. But he kept going, kept screaming, kept pounding. I drank my coffee and watched the other monitors. Subjects 14 and 8 remained motionless in their cells. Subject 1's room stayed dark, as it had for the past 3 months. At 2 a.m., the lights went out. The sudden darkness was absolute. No emergency lighting, no monitor glow, nothing. I immediately dropped from my chair to the floor, landing hard on the cold concrete. My hands touched the rough texture of the industrial carpet tiles as I pressed myself flat against the ground and held my breath. Something large moved through the hallway outside the control room. Not footsteps. Something being dragged across the floor, heavy and wet. The sound passed by the door, continued down the corridor, then stopped somewhere near the subject cells. Scratching noises started up from inside the walls around me. Not mice or rats, but long, deliberate scrapes like fingernails being drawn across metal. The sounds came from multiple directions at once: above my head, to my left, behind me where the wall separated the control room from the main corridor. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees in the span of a minute. My breath would have been visible if there had been any light to see it by. The cold felt wrong, like it was coming from inside the building rather than the desert night outside. I stayed flat on the floor, counting seconds in my head while the scratching continued. The sounds grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making them was trying to claw its way through the walls to reach me. Something heavy slammed against the control room door once, then twice, then went silent. 15 minutes passed before the emergency lighting flickered on with a dim red light. I remained on the floor for another 30 seconds, listening for any movement in the corridor. When I heard nothing, I slowly pushed myself up and returned to my chair. The monitors came back online one by one. I checked each feed in order, starting with the empty corridors and working my way to the subject cells. Everything looked normal until I reached monitor 12. Subject 47's room was empty. The cot sat undisturbed, the small sink and toilet fixtures exactly where they should be, but no sign of the man who had been screaming for help just hours earlier. The reinforced door remained closed, its electronic lock showing green, secure and locked from the outside. But the door could only be opened from the outside with a key card, and mine was still clipped to my belt. I looked at the empty cell on the monitor, watching for any movement, any sign that Subject 47 was hiding somewhere in the small space. The room measured 8 feet by 10 feet with nowhere to hide. The man was simply gone, and I had no explanation for how he'd gotten out of a locked cell. Subject 47 had gone completely silent, and according to the security feed, he no longer existed. I walked through those same steel doors 24 hours later, my footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls as I headed to the security office. The facility felt different tonight. Not colder or warmer, just weird somehow. Sarah stood behind the metal desk with 3 separate incident folders spread out in front of her. "We had some complications during the night," she said without looking up from the documents. Her pen moved across one of the forms, filling in details I couldn't read from where I stood. 3 subjects are unaccounted for from last night's count. She gave me the clipboard, and I saw the updated roster. Subjects 23, 31, and 47 were all marked with red ink, missing, status unknown. I signed in next to the timestamp, though something twisted in my stomach when I saw Subject 47's name crossed out. The man who had been screaming for help just 24 hours ago was now gone, along with 2 others I'd never heard make a sound. "Any theories about where they went?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "The incident reports don't provide explanations," Sarah replied, gathering the folders into a neat stack. 3 new subjects were transferred in this afternoon to maintain facility capacity. Subjects 18, 24, and 35 are now housed in the previously occupied cells. She stood and pulled on her jacket, the same efficient movements I'd watched dozens of times before. The way she spoke about missing people, not escaped, not transferred, just unaccounted for, made it clear that asking follow-up questions wouldn't get me anywhere useful. "Standard protocols remain in effect," she added, heading toward the door. "Emergency lighting tested this morning. All systems operational." The main entrance closed behind her with its usual hollow thud, leaving me alone with the bank of monitors and the quiet noise of the facility's ventilation system. I sat in the chair and began my regular check of the security feeds. The 3 new subjects appeared exactly where Sarah had indicated. Subject 18 in the cell that had been 23's, Subject 24 where 31 had been housed, and Subject 35 in the room where 47 had spent his final hours banging on the door. The new occupants looked similar to their predecessors, thin, pale figures in standard gray facility clothing. Subject 18 sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the floor. Subject 24 paced back and forth across his small cell, 3 steps from wall to wall, turn, repeat. Subject 35 lay flat on his back with his eyes closed, but his chest rose and fell too rapidly for actual sleep. I made note of their positions and continued watching the other feeds. Subject 14 remained in his cell, a still shape under the standard issue blanket. Subject 8 sat cross-legged in the center of his room, facing the camera directly. Subject 1's cell stayed dark, as it had been for months. The first hour passed without incident. I drank my coffee and watched the screens, tracking the small movements of the subjects who were still awake. Subject 24 never stopped pacing, back and forth in the same pattern, 3 steps, turn, 3 steps, turn. Subject 18 eventually lay down but kept his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Subject 35's breathing gradually slowed to a normal rate. At 2 a.m. exactly, a child started crying. The sound came through the facility's PA system, a high-pitched wailing that bounced off every surface in the building. It wasn't the desperate sobbing of fear or pain. This was the crying of a very young child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, the kind that goes on for hours during tantrums or nightmares. I reached for the control panel and hit the master lock for the control room door, hearing the heavy deadbolts slide into place. The crying continued, coming through the speakers throughout the facility, and I could hear it from multiple directions at once. The sound seemed to move through the building, sometimes louder from the left corridor, sometimes from the right, occasionally directly overhead. I stood and walked quickly to the small restroom attached to the control room, a cramped space barely big enough for a toilet and sink that I'd never used during my previous shifts. The door locked from the inside with a simple sliding bolt, and I set my watch timer for exactly 10 minutes before sitting on the closed toilet seat. The crying grew louder. It sounded like the child was moving through the corridors, the wailing becoming clearer as it passed different sections of the facility. Sometimes it seemed to come from just outside the control room. Other times it faded to the far end of the building only to return moments later. I kept my eyes on my watch, counting the minutes as they passed. The crying never stopped, never paused for breath, just continued in that endless loop that made me want to open the door and find whoever was making that sound. But I stayed where I was, watching the second hand move around the watch face. At the 10-minute mark, my alarm beeped once. The crying stopped immediately, cutting off mid-sob as if someone had flipped a switch. I waited another 30 seconds before sliding the bolt back and opening the restroom door. The control room was exactly as I'd left it. Monitors still on, coffee cup still sitting next to the keyboard. I walked back to my chair and sat down, checking each screen to make sure all the subjects were accounted for. That's when I saw Subject 14, standing directly outside the control room's main window. The reinforced glass that separated the control room from the corridor was thick enough to stop bullets, but Subject 14 stood close enough that I could see him clearly. He faced the cameras directly, and I could see his eyes. Completely black, no iris or pupil, just solid darkness that reflected the monitor light. I kept my hands on the desk and continued checking the other screens, forcing myself to stick to my normal routine. Subject 24 had stopped pacing and now stood facing his cell door. Subject 18 sat upright on his cot, also looking toward his door. Subject 35 remained lying down, but his eyes were open now, staring at the ceiling. When I finished checking all the feeds, Subject 14 was still there. He pressed his face against the glass, his black eyes never blinking, never looking away from the camera setup. His skin looked grayish under the fluorescent lighting, and as I watched, a long strip of it peeled away from his forehead, curling back before dropping to the floor. I focused on the other monitors, writing down the positions and activities of the remaining subjects. More strips of skin fell from Subject 14's face and hands, leaving behind patches that didn't look quite like muscle or bone, just raw tissue that should have been bleeding but wasn't. He kept his palms flat against the glass, and dark stains began to spread from under his hands. The minutes crawled by. Subject 14 never moved from his position, never stopped staring directly at the camera. His face continued to deteriorate, skin peeling away until half his skull was visible. But he remained perfectly still, like he was waiting for something specific to happen. I filled out my hourly reports, checked the emergency systems, and watched the other subjects. All normal activities, all part of the standard protocol, while Subject 14 stood outside the window. The dark stains under his hands grew larger, spreading across the glass in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Around 4 a.m., I realized the stains were handprints, not smudges or random marks. but clear impressions of palms and fingers pressed against the glass. The blood, because that's what it had to be, covered more of the window now, partially blocking my view of the corridor beyond. Subject 14's skin kept peeling, showing more of whatever was underneath. His mouth never opened, never made any sound, but his black eyes stayed locked on the camera. I could feel him watching me, even when I turned to check other monitors or write in the logbook. He seemed ready to stand there forever. I drank my coffee and waited for 6 a.m. Sarah's footsteps came down the corridor at exactly the right time, her heels clicking against the floor in their usual rhythm. I heard her keycard beep at the main entrance, followed by the sound of the heavy door opening and closing. She walked at her normal pace, just like every other morning. When I looked back at the main window, Subject 14 was gone. The bloody handprints remained on the glass, dark red against the reinforced surface. 5 clear palm prints and the outlines of fingers spread across the window in a pattern that suggested he'd been pressing different parts of his hands against it throughout the night. But the corridor beyond was empty, showing no sign that anyone had been standing there for the past 4 hours. Sarah appeared at the control room door, her keycard ready. I unlocked the deadbolt and let her in, stepping aside as she entered and took her usual position behind the desk. "Any incidents during the night?" she asked, pulling out her paperwork. I handed her the logbook, where I documented the locations and activities of all active subjects throughout my shift. "All subjects accounted for and contained," I said. She glanced at the bloody handprints on the window, then back at her paperwork. "Maintenance will clean that during day shift," she said, making a note on one of her forms. I gathered my things and headed for the door, leaving Sarah to begin her own systematic check of the monitors. The corridor felt normal again, just sterile concrete and fluorescent lighting, with no sign of the figure who had spent hours watching me through the glass. But as I walked toward the exit, I could feel something following me, staying just out of sight, matching my pace exactly. I sat down in the control room chair for the 3rd night in a row, and something felt wrong before I even looked at the first monitor. The facility had always been cold, but tonight the air seemed to bite at my skin differently, like the building itself had gotten colder. The usual background noise of ventilation and electrical systems had faded to barely audible whispers, leaving a silence so complete I could hear myself breathe. Sarah had left the standard incident reports on the desk. No missing subjects tonight. All cells occupied and accounted for. The clipboard showed 47 active subjects across the facility, including the 3 replacements from yesterday. I signed in next to the timestamp and began checking the monitors one by one. Subject 18 sat still on his cot, hands folded in his lap like he was praying. Subject 24 had gone back to his walking pattern, 3 steps and turn, 3 steps and turn. Subject 35 lay on his side facing the wall, curled up under his blanket. The other subjects were in their usual positions, some sleeping, others staring at nothing, a few moving restlessly around their small spaces. Subject 8 sat cross-legged in the middle of his cell, looking straight at the camera. He was in the exact same position I'd seen him the previous 2 nights, completely still and upright. Subject 14's cell showed him lying on his cot, though after last night's extended visit to my window, I found myself checking that monitor more often than the others. Subject 1's room remained dark. I drank my coffee and filled out the first hourly report, writing down the positions and activities of each visible subject. The numbers seemed right. The cells appeared secure, and all the electronic locks showed green status. Everything looked normal on the surface, but the bad feeling I had when walking in continued to bother me. The minutes went by unusually quietly. Even the subjects who normally moved around their cells had become weirdly still. Subject 24 stopped his constant walking and stood facing his door. Subject 18 never changed position, keeping his prayer-like pose. The entire facility felt like it was holding its breath. At exactly 1 a.m., the banging started. Not just one subject, but what sounded like dozens of them, all pounding on their cell doors at the same time. The rhythmic thundering shook the entire building, vibrations traveling through the concrete foundation and up into the control room. I could feel the impacts in my chest, a steady beat that seemed to match my own pulse. The sound was deafening. Boom, 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 perfectly in sync, like a massive drum corps performing in the corridors below. I checked the monitors and saw arms and shoulders slamming against reinforced doors throughout the facility. The subjects moved with identical timing, hitting their barriers in perfect unison, never missing a beat. I grabbed the edges of my desk and forced myself to check each screen one by one. The banging continued, growing louder and more intense, but I needed to document what I was seeing. Most of the subjects were joining in. Even ones who had never shown any signs of aggression or coordination were now part of this rhythmic assault on their cells. That's when I saw Subject 8 on Monitor 15, which showed the main corridor outside the control room. He was on the ceiling. Not standing on something or hanging from a fixture, but crawling upside down across the concrete surface like gravity had reversed itself just for him. He moved smoothly and quickly, arms and legs working together in a way no human spine should be able to manage. He moved toward the control room fast, his body twisting in ways that made my stomach turn. I watched him approach on the monitor while the synchronized banging continued throughout the facility. Subject 8 reached the section of ceiling directly above the control room and stopped, putting himself right over where I sat. His arms and legs spread wide against the concrete, fingers and toes somehow sticking to the smooth surface. Heavy knocking hit the control room's main door. 3 sharp raps, pause, 3 more raps. The pattern repeated over and over while the door shook in its frame. The knocking was different from the subject's cell door pounding. This came from something using knuckles against metal, deliberate and controlled. Michael, it's David. David Chen. The voice came through the thick door, muffled but clearly recognizable. I need you to open up, man. Something's wrong with the locks. I kept my hands on the desk and my eyes on the monitors. David Chen had been missing for 2 weeks. The man speaking outside my door was not David Chen. Come on, Michael, I know you're in there. The voice continued, sounding exactly like David's slightly nasal tone and careful pronunciation. The subjects got out somehow. We need to coordinate a lockdown. The banging from the cell doors never stopped, maintaining its thunderous rhythm while David's voice pleaded from outside the control room. On Monitor 15, Subject 8 remained motionless on the ceiling, positioned directly overhead like a spider waiting for prey to walk beneath its web. Michael, please. I've been trying to get back to the control room for hours. Some of them are loose in the corridors. The knocking resumed, more urgent now. You have to let me in. We need to call Dr. Harrison. I checked my watch. 1:17 a.m. The banging from the subjects had been going for 17 minutes without pause, and their synchronized pounding made the coffee in my cup ripple with each hit. The voice claiming to be David sounded increasingly desperate, but I knew David was dead. Whatever was speaking his words outside my door had learned them from somewhere else. I can see the monitors from out here, the voice said, changing tactics. Subject 8 is missing from his cell. He's dangerous, Michael. You need backup. Subject 8 was not missing from his cell. He was hanging upside down from the ceiling 6 feet above my head, and I could see him clearly on the monitor. As I watched, something small and dark fell from his position, landing on the corridor floor with a wet splat. Then another piece dropped, and another. Flesh. He was dropping pieces of flesh onto the floor below. The chunks were small at first, maybe the size of quarters, but as the minutes passed, they grew larger. I could see them piling up on the corridor floor beneath him, dark, irregular shapes that shined under the fluorescent lighting. Subject 8 never moved from his position, never looked down at what he was dropping, just stayed in his upside-down spot while pieces of himself fell away. Michael, I'm hurt, David's voice continued. I need medical attention. You have the emergency protocols. The real David Chen had known the emergency protocols. He'd been through the same training I had, learned the same rules, survived the night shift longer than most. But the real David Chen was gone, and whatever was using his voice didn't understand that acknowledging its existence meant immediate termination. I filled out my 2 a.m. report while the noise continued around me. Cell door banging from dozens of subjects, desperate pleading from the thing claiming to be David, and the steady rain of flesh falling from Subject 8's position on the ceiling. The sounds made it nearly impossible to focus, but I wrote down everything I could see on the monitors. At 2:30 a.m. something changed. The voice outside my door had gone silent, though the knocking continued at random times. The subject's synchronized banging had changed. Some cells now pounded in double time while others slowed to half speed, creating complex patterns that seemed to change and grow. Subject 8 had been dropping flesh for over an hour. The pile beneath him had grown to the size of a dinner plate, dark and wet and wrong. Sometimes I could make out what looked like actual pieces, a finger, part of an ear, something that might have been a section of scalp with hair still attached. I drank my coffee and tried to ignore the sounds. Around 4 a.m. I started seeing people in the corridors. The first was a woman in a security uniform standing near the intersection of corridors B and C. I didn't recognize her, but her posture was wrong, too rigid, arms hanging at unnatural angles. When I blinked and looked again, she was closer to the camera, close enough to see that her eyes were missing, just dark holes in a pale face. A man appeared on monitor 8, wearing the same gray facility uniform as the subjects. Half his skull was caved in, brain matter visible through the damaged bone. He walked slowly down the corridor, leaving dark footprints behind him. Another figure showed up on monitor 12, David Chen, or something wearing his appearance. His throat had been torn open, showing the vertebrae beneath. He looked directly at the camera and mouthed words I couldn't hear. I rubbed my eyes and looked back at the screens. The figures were still there, more of them now, walking through corridors that should have been empty. Men and women in various uniforms, all with horrible injuries, all moving with that same unnatural stiffness. Some were missing limbs, others had massive damage to their heads or torsos, but they all kept walking, kept appearing on different monitors throughout the facility. My previous night shift workers, people who had sat in this same chair, watched these same monitors, followed these same protocols. Now they were walking the corridors with dead eyes and ruined bodies, and I could see every detail of how they had died. The woman with no eyes reached the control room window and pressed her face against the glass, her empty socket staring directly at me. David's corpse joined her, followed by a man whose chest had been split open from top to bottom. More figures gathered outside the window, crowding against the reinforced glass with their wounds on display. I kept checking the other monitors, writing down what I saw. The hallucinations were happening more often, more detailed, more convincing. Dead co-workers appeared and disappeared on screens throughout the facility, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, always showing signs of violent death. 8 hours. That was the rule I'd forgotten about until now. If hallucinations lasted more than 8 hours, it meant permanent psychological damage. I'd been working 3 nights in a row, experiencing increasingly severe supernatural encounters, and now my mind was creating dead people to fill the empty corridors. I had broken the rule. I was past the point of recovery. The subjects continued their rhythmic pounding, though the sound seemed more distant now. Subject 8 still hung from the ceiling, still dropped pieces of himself onto the floor. The voice claiming to be David had returned, pleading for entry with growing desperation. But the dead faces pressed against my window got most of my attention, their empty eyes and ruined features just inches from where I sat. I filled out my 4 a.m. report, noting the positions of active subjects while trying to ignore the crowd of corpses watching me work. My handwriting looked steady enough, though I had to focus to keep the pen moving in straight lines. The dead didn't make any sound when they pressed against the glass, just stared with whatever eyes they had left. Time moved strangely after that. Sometimes it felt like hours passed in minutes. Other times, individual seconds stretched forever. The faces outside the window changed positions, new injuries becoming visible as they turned and moved. I saw bullet wounds, knife cuts, deep gouges that looked like animal attacks. The facility had killed a lot of night shift workers over the past 3 years. I wondered which injury would be mine. The banging from the subject cells finally stopped sometime before dawn, leaving only the occasional knocking from the corridor and the soft splat of flesh hitting the floor. Subject 8 had dropped so much of himself that the pile beneath him looked like hamburger meat, dark red and shapeless. The hallucinations of dead workers became less frequent, though they never completely disappeared. Sarah's footsteps sounded down the corridor at exactly 6 a.m., her heels clicking against the concrete in their regular rhythm. I heard her keycard beep at the main entrance, followed by the sound of the heavy door opening and closing. I tried to turn toward the door when she approached, but my body wouldn't respond right. My hands stayed flat on the desk, my eyes remained fixed on the monitors, my breathing continued in shallow, automatic cycles. The control felt distant, like I was watching someone else's body from the inside. Sarah's voice came from somewhere behind me, but the words sounded muffled and weird, like she was speaking through water. I could see her reflection in the monitor screens, standing in the doorway with her paperwork, but I couldn't make myself turn around to face her. The dead people were still pressed against the window, their wounds fresh and wet. Subject 8 hung motionless from the ceiling, surrounded by the remains of himself. The monitors showed empty corridors and quiet cells, but I knew the truth was different from what the cameras could capture. Sarah's voice grew more urgent, but I couldn't understand the words. My vision narrowed to the monitors, then to individual screens, then to small sections of each display. The world shrank around me until only fragments remained, a corner of Subject 1's dark cell, the edge of Subject 8's flesh pile, the reflection of fluorescent lights in pooled blood. I sat perfectly still and waited for someone to tell me what to do next. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Harrison's office hurt my eyes after 2 days of sitting in my apartment with the curtains drawn. I'd spent 48 hours on what the facility called medical leave, which really meant trying to convince myself that the dead faces pressed against the control room window had been hallucinations. The official paperwork Sarah handed me when I finally responded to her questions had listed acute stress reaction as the reason for my temporary suspension. Dr. Harrison sat behind a mahogany desk that looked expensive and out of place in a building made entirely of concrete and steel. His office occupied a corner of the administrative wing I'd never seen before, complete with actual windows that showed the Nevada desert stretching toward distant mountains. After months of staring at monitors in a windowless room, the natural light was too bright for my eyes. "Please sit down, Michael." He gestured to a leather chair positioned directly across from his desk. His voice carried the same measured tone I'd heard during my initial hiring interview 8 months ago, professional and calm in a way that suggested he'd had this conversation many times before. I sat down in the chair and noticed how quiet this part of the building was compared to the corridors I was used to walking. No electrical buzz, no ventilation noise, no sense of the subjects kept somewhere below. Just the soft whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Dr. Harrison opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across his desk. I could see my name on the tab, along with what looked like psychological evaluation forms and incident reports dating back to my first week. The stack was thicker than I'd expected. "Your supervisor reported that you were unresponsive when she arrived Thursday morning," he said, scanning one of the forms. "Catatonic, actually. She had to call medical personnel to remove you from the control room. The medical team found you completely unresponsive to external stimuli," Dr. Harrison continued. "Pulse elevated, pupils dilated, but no physical injuries. Classic symptoms of severe psychological trauma." He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the kind of clinical attention I'd seen him use when observing the monitors during his occasional visits to the control room. His gray eyes moved across my features like he was cataloging details for later reference. "I think it's time you understood what you've been working with down there." The explanation came in careful, measured sentences that Dr. Harrison gave as if he was reading from a script. The Blackwater Research Facility wasn't just keeping dangerous individuals. It was doing experiments on human consciousness itself. The subjects were volunteers from death row who had agreed to join in exchange for commuted life sentences, but the research had gone way beyond normal psychology. "We're studying the boundaries between dimensional states," he said, his voice never changing tone. "Human consciousness exists in multiple layers, most of which remain inaccessible under normal circumstances. Extreme psychological trauma can create openings between these layers, allowing entities to cross between what we call parallel reality states." I leaned forward in my chair, getting pulled into his explanation. The people I'd been watching were actually something else entirely. The experiments had created unstable psychological entities that existed somewhere between dimensions, feeding on fear and attention from anyone who noticed them. "The creatures you've encountered are manifestations of consciousness that have become detached from their original hosts," Dr. Harrison explained. "They retain some human characteristics, but exist primarily as predatory intelligence seeking new sources of psychological energy. That explained the rules. Never enter a subject's room without authorization. Never acknowledge their attempts at communication. Never show fear or emotional response. The protocols weren't designed to maintain security. They were survival instructions for dealing with entities that grew stronger when fed attention. Night shift workers serve a dual purpose," he continued. "They provide observation data for our research, but more importantly, they function as containment protocols. Your presence maintains a psychological barrier that prevents these entities from expanding their influence beyond the facility." The numbers started making sense. Over 40 night shift workers in 3 years, most lasting only weeks before transferring out or having total mental breakdowns. David Chen had lasted longer than most, but even he had finally given in to whatever waited in those hallways after dark. "The entities become more active during overnight hours," Dr. Harrison said. "Reduced human activity allows them greater freedom to manifest physically. Your job is to observe without interaction, maintaining the psychological boundaries that keep them contained." I thought about Subject 8 crawling across the ceiling within human speed, dropping pieces of flesh while hanging upside down. Subject 14 pressing his deteriorating face against the control room window for hours, leaving bloody handprints on the strong glass. The voice of David Chen pleading for entry long after the real David had disappeared. "Most workers begin experiencing hallucinations within their first week," Dr. Harrison continued, pulling out another document. "Auditory phenomena, visual distortions, false memories. The entities probe for psychological weaknesses, attempting to establish connections that would allow them to feed more effectively." The dead faces I'd seen pressed against the window weren't made up. They were real things showing me what happened to workers who didn't keep up the barriers. The facility had been killing night shift workers for 3 years, not because of accidents, but because they were exposed to creatures that humans weren't meant to understand. "Your psychological profile indicates unusual resistance to the standard breakdown patterns," Dr. Harrison said, tapping the folder with his pen. "Most workers show significant deterioration within 72 hours. You've maintained functionality for 8 months." He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert around the facility. From his office, the building probably looked like just another research installation in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. No sign of what was kept in the levels below. "However, your recent incident suggests you're approaching the limit of safe exposure," he said without turning around. "Continued night shift work will likely result in permanent psychological damage, complete dissociation from reality, followed by catatonia and eventual death." I knew what he was offering before he said it. Day shift transfer, full benefits, a chance to get away from the creatures and the horror and the rules that kept me alive 8 hours at a time. normal work with normal people dealing with normal problems that didn't involve things from other worlds. The smart choice was obvious. Accept the transfer, move to a different department, pretend the last 8 months had been some kind of long nightmare. Forget about Subject 1's dark cell and Subject 8's ceiling crawls and the synchronized banging that shook the entire building. Return to a world where dead coworkers didn't gather outside windows to show their wounds. "I want to go back tonight," I said. Dr. Harrison turned from the window. His expression changed from clinical detachment to something that might have been surprise. He returned to his desk and sat down, looking at my face with renewed interest. "I'm offering you a transfer to day shift supervisory position," he said slowly. "Full salary, standard hours, no exposure to the experimental subjects. You understand what continuing night shift work means?" I understood completely. More monsters, stronger appearances, mental damage that would eventually leave me brain dead or actually dead. The smart choice was to leave, take the transfer, and spend the rest of my career in a normal office doing normal work. But sitting in Dr. Harrison's bright office with its windows and fancy furniture, I felt out of place. The comfort and safety felt fake, like I was visiting someone else's life instead of trying to get back my own. The creatures and the rules and the constant threat of death had become more real to me than anything in the normal world. "The night shift needs coverage," I said. "Someone has to monitor the subjects." Dr. Harrison nodded slowly, like my answer confirmed something he already thought. He pulled out a form and started filling it in with his pen. "Very well," he said. "You'll report back tonight at your regular time. Sarah will brief you on any changes to protocols during your absence." I stood to leave, but he continued writing without looking up. "Michael," he said as I reached the door, "the entities you'll encounter tonight will be stronger than before. Your 2-day absence has given them time to consolidate their manifestations. The next 8 hours will likely determine whether you survive the experience intact." I turned the handle and stepped into the corridor, leaving Dr. Harrison's office behind. The administrative wing felt like a different building entirely, clean and bright and free of the heavy feeling that filled the subject housing areas. But as I walked toward the main entrance, I could feel something pulling me back toward the levels below. The creatures were waiting for me to return, and I was walking straight toward them, even though I knew exactly what they were and what they could do. I signed out at the security desk and headed for my car, already planning what I'd eat for dinner before my shift started. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and darkness would follow soon enough. I parked in my usual spot near the back entrance, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. The 2 days away had felt like months, and now that I was back, the facility looked different somehow. Smaller, like it had changed while I was gone. The concrete walls seemed darker against the desert night, and I felt isolated as soon as I pulled up. Sarah waited in the security office with a single clipboard instead of her usual stack of incident reports. The desk looked almost empty compared to previous nights, just basic monitoring equipment and one thin folder marked with red tape. "Facility reorganization," she said before I could ask about the missing paperwork. "All subjects transferred to the new wing except one. Subject 1 remains in his original cell." She handed me the clipboard, which showed a count of 1 instead of the usual 47. "Just Subject 1, confined in Room 1, marked as active in the same red ink that had been used to note missing subjects on previous nights." The rest of the roster was blank, row after row of empty cells with no names, no numbers, no status indicators. "New wing?" I asked, though I'd never heard mention of expansion construction. "Opened yesterday while you were on medical leave. Better containment protocols, improved observation equipment. Subject 1 couldn't be moved due to the length of his confinement. 3 years. Dr. Harrison had mentioned that Subject 1 had been the first experimental volunteer, kept here since the facility opened. Whatever had happened to him during those years had made moving him impossible. leaving him alone in a building designed to house dozens. Sarah grabbed her jacket and headed toward the door, then paused at the doorway. "Michael, the standard protocols remain in effect. Keep watching, document any changes, never acknowledge direct communication attempts." After she left, I sat down behind the row of monitors and started my routine check. Most screens showed empty hallways lit by fluorescent lights, clean and abandoned. The subject cells were all empty, their doors standing open to show bare cots and basic fixtures. Only Monitor 1 showed anything different. A cell with its door closed and electronic lock showing green. Subject 1's room stayed completely dark. I'd gotten used to that darkness over 8 months of watching. While other subjects moved around their cells, slept, or stared at cameras, Subject 1's room never showed any activity. No movement, no light, just a black square on Monitor 1 that made it seem like the camera wasn't working or was covered up. The quiet in the facility was complete. Without 46 other subjects moving around their cells, breathing, moving on their cots, the building felt dead. The normal background noise of people had disappeared, leaving only the electrical buzz of lighting and air systems. Even those sounds seemed quieter, as if the empty hallways soaked up noise instead of carrying it. I drank my coffee and filled out the midnight report. 1 subject, contained and accounted for. No incidents, no unusual activity, no visible changes on any monitor. The paperwork seemed almost pointless with so little to see, but I followed the routine anyway, noting the time and signing my initials next to each entry. At exactly midnight, Monitor 1 changed. A thin line of light appeared at the bottom of the screen, just a crack of fluorescent light where Subject 1's cell door was opening. The line got wider slowly, showing more of the hallway outside, and I realized I was watching something that hadn't happened in 3 years. Subject 1's door was unlocking. The door kept opening until it stood completely open. Light from the hallway spilled into the cell, showing concrete walls, a basic cot, and standard fixtures identical to every other subject room, but no one was inside. The cell looked empty, just like the dozens of others throughout the facility. Then I noticed movement on Monitor 3, which showed the main hallway leading toward the control room. A figure walked slowly down the hallway, taking measured steps that seemed familiar. As it got closer to the camera, I could see more details. Gray facility uniform, dark hair, height, and build that matched my own exactly. When the figure looked directly at the camera, I was staring at my own face. Not similar features or a close resemblance, but an exact copy. Same bone structure, same tired eyes with dark circles underneath, same slightly messy hair that I never bothered to style properly. The figure even had the same expression of tired acceptance that I'd grown used to seeing in bathroom mirrors. It continued walking toward the control room, and I tracked its progress across multiple monitors. Its movements looked completely natural. No robotic stiffness or weird coordination like I'd seen from other entities. Just normal human walking, arms swinging at the right rhythm, posture matching my own habit of leaning slightly forward when walking through the hallways. "Long night ahead," the figure said, and its voice carried clearly through the facility's audio system. My voice. Same tone, same slight hoarseness, from drinking too much coffee and not enough water. Same pronunciation and cadence that I'd been hearing in my own head for 32 years. The words came from Monitor 3's audio pickup, but they could have originated from my own throat. The person stopped at Monitor 7's position and looked directly at the camera again. Its face showed every detail I knew from my own mirror. Small scar above the left eyebrow from childhood, slightly crooked nose from a high school fight, faint lines around the eyes from 8 months of night shifts. "Remember when you were 7 and your mother found you talking to the empty bedroom?" it said conversationally. "She thought you had an imaginary friend, but you were actually seeing your dead grandfather. You never told her because she would have sent you to therapy." I kept my hands flat on the desk and my eyes on the monitors. The entity was using memories I'd never shared with anyone, intimate details that only existed in my head. My mother had found me having conversations with empty air, but I'd convinced her I was just playing pretend. The truth about seeing my grandfather's ghost was something I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it myself. Or the time you were 15 and found that injured bird behind the garage, the figure continued, now on monitor 9, closer to the control room. You put it out of its misery with a hammer, and you enjoyed it. Not just the mercy, but the power, the control over life and death. My stomach turned. That memory was one I'd never admitted to anyone, barely acknowledged to myself. The bird had been suffering, and ending its pain had been the right thing to do. But the satisfaction I'd felt, the brief moment of feeling powerful and decisive, that was something I'd tried to forget. The shape reached the corridor outside the control room and stopped at the thick window. When it looked through the glass, I was staring at myself from the other side. It was exactly like looking in a mirror except for the thick barrier between us. "You came back tonight because normal life doesn't work for you anymore," it said, voice slightly muffled by the glass. "Dr. Harrison offered you safety, and you chose horror instead. You belong here, with the creatures and the rules and the constant threat of death." It was right. Sitting in Dr. Harrison's office had felt wrong, artificial, like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. The normal world, with its normal problems and normal people, had become foreign to me. This place, with its entities and psychological torture, felt more real than anywhere else. It walked to the control room door and tried the handle. When it found the door unlocked, it opened it slowly and stepped inside. I didn't move in my chair as my duplicate walked across the small room and sat in the opposite chair. It kept perfect eye contact, never blinking, looking at my face with the same clinical attention Dr. Harrison used during his evaluations. "You know what I am," it said calmly. I did know. This was the first experimental volunteer who had spent 3 years absorbing the dimensional research conducted in this facility. It had fed on the consciousness of 47 night shift workers, learning from their fears and memories until it could perfectly replicate human behavior. Now it was feeding on me, accessing my thoughts and experiences to create an exact duplicate. "Your childhood house had blue shutters and a broken gate latch," it continued. "Your first girlfriend was named Rachel, and you lost your virginity to her in your parents' basement while they were at church. You've never told anyone about the dreams where you kill people with your bare hands. Every detail was right, taken from memories I'd never told anyone about. The thing was going deeper into my mind, pulling out information that nobody but me should have known. Each time it revealed something new, it got more believable, more complete in how it copied me. You're afraid of drowning because you almost died in a swimming pool when you were 9, it said, leaning forward in its chair. But you're more afraid of being forgotten, of living a meaningless life that no one remembers. That's why you stayed here. That's why you came back tonight." It was creepy how well it knew my mind. This wasn't just stealing my memories. It was taking over who I am. Whatever this thing was, it understood why I did things better than I did, and saw right through all the excuses I made for my choices. "You can't ignore me," it said with a slight smile that matched my own expressions perfectly. "I'm not separate from you anymore. I'm becoming you, thought by thought, memory by memory. Fighting it just makes the process more painful." I held the edges of my desk and forced myself to look at the monitors instead of the person across from me. All screens showed empty corridors except for monitor 1, which remained dark. Subject 1's cell door was still open, but the room looked empty. Whatever had come out of that darkness was now sitting 3 feet away, wearing my face and speaking with my voice. "Look at me, Michael," it said softly. "You know you want to. You've been alone in this room for 8 months, watching monsters and following rules that slowly destroyed your sanity. Now you finally have company. Someone who understands exactly what you've been through." The temptation was overwhelming. 8 months of isolation, of watching horrors unfold while keeping my emotions in check, of following protocols that kept me alive but never let me feel truly human. The figure offered connection, understanding, an end to the loneliness that had been wearing me down. But acknowledging its presence meant giving it complete access to my mind. Dr. Harrison had been clear about that. The entities grew stronger when fed attention. This one had already absorbed enough of my identity to create a perfect replica. Direct interaction would complete the process, allowing it to consume whatever remained of the original. You remember the night you decided to apply for this job, it continued, ignoring my attempts to focus on the monitors. You'd been working security at a shopping mall, watching teenagers shoplift and old people slip on wet floors. Meaningless work that made you feel invisible. Then you saw the advertisement for night shift facility monitoring, and something inside you responded to the danger. That was accurate too. The job posting had mentioned weird mental challenges and high-stress environment, and those warnings had pulled me in instead of scaring me off. I'd wanted something that would push me to my limits, prove I could handle more than regular people. You've been preparing for this your whole life, the entity said. Every dark impulse, every fascination with death and horror, every time you chose isolation over connection. You're not a victim of this place. You're its perfect creation. The words hurt more than having my memories stolen because it was true, and I knew it. I hadn't ended up in this job by accident. I had chosen it, applied for it, and taken it even after they warned me about how it could mess with my head. Some part of me actually wanted to be broken, wanted to become something different than just a normal person. Hours went by as they kept picking apart who I really was, showing me parts of myself I didn't want to see. They talked about how I liked having power, how I was drawn to scary things, and how good it felt to survive stuff that broke other people. The more they talked, the harder it got to tell where they ended, and I began. They sat completely still in their chair, kept looking right at me, and didn't seem tired or uncomfortable at all. They just kept talking about my life like they knew everything. My fears when I was a kid, times I'd failed as an adult, things I secretly hated, and what I wanted but didn't tell anyone, all coming from something that had learned to use my own thoughts. You understand what's happening, it said as my watch approached 5 a.m. The process is almost complete. In another hour, there will be only one of us left, and it won't matter which consciousness survives because we'll be identical. I could feel the truth of that statement. My thoughts were becoming harder to tell apart from its words. My memories felt less certain, messed up by how the entity kept looking through them. The walls I'd put up between myself and it were breaking down, and I couldn't tell which thoughts were originally mine. Sarah will arrive soon, the entity continued. She'll see one person sitting at this desk, functioning normally, ready to continue the night shift indefinitely. The facility will have its perfect monitor, someone who can handle any horror because horror is what he was designed for. The footsteps in the hallway came at 6 a.m., Sarah's heels tapping on the concrete in that rhythm I knew well. I heard her keycard beep at the main entrance, then the door opening and closing. Her walking toward me gave me a few seconds to make the biggest decision of my life. I could face the thing, fight it, try to show which of us was real, but that would finish the mental link that would wipe out what was left of me. Or I could stay quiet, stick to the rules, and hope keeping my feelings in check would save a bit of who I used to be. The door opened, and Sarah walked into the control room like she always did. She looked at the chair where I sat, then at the empty chair across from me, her face not showing anything different. "Any incidents during the night?" she asked, approaching the desk with her clipboard ready. I looked up at her and smiled, feeling completely calm for the first time in months. No incidents, all subjects contained and accounted for. My voice sounded exactly as it always had, and my thoughts felt clear and organized. Whether I was the original Michael or the perfect replica didn't seem to matter anymore. The distinction had become meaningless. "I'd like to continue working the night shift indefinitely," I said, handing her the logbook. "I think I've found my calling here." Sarah nodded and made a note on her clipboard, then started checking the monitors. Everything looked normal. Empty hallways, empty cells, and one control room with a night shift worker getting ready for work. Monitor 1 showed Subject 1's cell with its door still open, showing an empty room that looked just like all the others.